So let's keep moving. Let's go ahead and move to our second question. For that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our panelists representing our media partners from the Bangor Daily News and the Sun Journal. He's the politics editor from the Sun Journal. Please welcome in Scott Bissell. Scott.
Thanks a lot, Greg. As you know, there's been a lot of news about a nurse from Maine, and she's coming back today. Her name is Casey Hickox, the nurse who has recently returned from Africa and is now on her way back to Maine after being quarantined in New Jersey for several days. She became the first public test case for a mandatory quarantine in New York and New Jersey. She has been critical of her own treatment there. She didn't want to stay there. Here's the question. Do you believe her treatment was appropriate? Should there be a federal quarantine for similar cases right now? And should there be new federal restrictions on travel to and from West Africa? Based on our format, this question goes to Shenna Bellows first.
First, I'd like to thank Casey and all of the nurses and doctors, people with Doctors Without Borders, who have gone to West Africa and risked their lives to try to confront the epidemic at its source. They are doing our country a great service because all of the national experts say that the best way to control and confront this epidemic is confronting it at its source. And so I'm very concerned. We should be treating them as heroes, not pariahs, not criminals. And when she arrived in this country, she was treated as a criminal. So I think it's very important. Of course, we should be monitoring travel. Of course, we should be making sure that our hospitals and medical facilities are 100% prepared. And President Obama is doing that. And where we lack preparedness is because of some of the bills, sequestration, which undermined funding for Centers for Disease Control and for the National Institutes of Health. The NIH director said, but for sequestration, which Susan voted for, we'd have an Ebola vaccine by now. So I think that absolutely we can do more for public health preparedness, and we're on the right track.
Senator Collins, it's your turn.
First, let me answer your question. I don't agree with the way that Casey was treated. I think it was inhumane and unnecessary for her to be put into a tent, restricted as far as what food she was given, no television, really isolated. That's not the way that we should treat a medical personnel who traveled to West Africa, helped to treat Ebola victims, and then returned to this country. We cannot ignore, however, that some healthcare workers who've been so brave to go to West Africa may be carrying the virus when they return. We have the real-life example of the doctor in New York City who traveled all over the city despite his exposure, and it's now come down with this horrific disease which has a 70% fatality rate. So what has happened now is she has been released to come back home to Maine. I'm very happy about that because the Maine CDC has put in place very responsible and sensible protocols. The administration's policy has been a moving target. It's been a disaster because the president has always been one step behind.
So new federal restrictions for travel to and from West Africa, or no federal restrictions?
I oppose a travel ban. I think that we want to make sure that healthcare workers can travel to West Africa and know that they can come home again.
As I have said from the beginning, I think that we should have some limited travel restrictions until the epidemic is brought under control. But I've always said I would exempt healthcare workers and aid personnel because we don't want to turn our back on West Africa, and it's essential that we help control this epidemic. They simply do not have the expertise to do so. You know, it's interesting that in this administration, just to show you how confusing it is, the Army has instituted a 21-day quarantine while the CDC is still trying to figure out what to do. So we have different standards for civilian versus military personnel, even though our military personnel are not involved in directing direct care of Ebola victims, they're building healthcare facilities.
It sounds like we have broad agreement. I'm stepping back in for Scott. Appreciation to Scott. It sounds like there's broad agreement on that there should be at least empathy for those who are care workers and aid workers who are working in Africa right now and who are returning to our country, but vigilance as well when it comes to their return. All right, we're all in agreement on that. If we may, let's go ahead and move on to question 3, if we may.